I had just stepped out of the cab from my sister's funeral when I saw my front yard, the place I'd tended for 30 years, turned into a dumping ground. My mother's quilt, my late husband's navy uniform, even the photo from our wedding day lay scattered across the wet grass, soaked in mud. And there she was, my daughter-in-law Maya, standing at the door with her arms crossed, phone in hand, eyes sharp as knives. She didn't even flinch when I gasped. Instead, she smirked and said, "The nursery needs space. That old junk had to go." My grief, still fresh from burying my sister, twisted into something darker. My son Daniel stood behind her, his hands shoved in his pockets, eyes darting anywhere but toward me. When I knelt to pick up the photo frame, Maya stepped forward, her heel slicing through the glass with a sharp crack. A shard nicked my palm and I didn't even feel it. Pain was too small compared to humiliation. I straightened slowly, looking her dead in the eye. "Then clear out one more piece of trash from my house." She laughed, a cold hollow sound. I didn't answer. I just bent down again, gathered the broken frame, and felt something inside me harden. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and cut grass. It had always been a peaceful scent to me until that day. My yard, my memories were soaked and muddied, as if someone had ripped open a photo album and stomped on every page. The wooden chest my brother built in 1978 was pried open, its hinges snapped. My mother's handwritten recipes were scattered in the mud ink, bleeding into nothing. I picked them up one by one, trembling, my knees pressing into the cold earth. Daniel shifted awkwardly in the doorway. "Mom, maybe just let it go for now. Let it go." The words stabbed deeper than the shard, still stuck in my hand. Maya walked down the steps, her perfume sweet and suffocating. "We're redoing the upstairs," she said evenly. "You can move your things into the guest shed in the back. It's temporary. The baby needs calm, open space." I stared at her flat stomach, at the gleam in her eyes. There was no warmth there, no kindness, only ownership. "The shed," I repeated, my voice dry. "That's where you can be," she said, smiling like she was giving me charity. I walked past her, each step deliberate. My shoes squished in the mud as I made my way around the house to the small wooden shed behind the garden. I hadn't opened that door in years. The hinges groaned when I pushed it. Inside, dust floated in the narrow light from a cracked window. A single folding mattress leaned against the wall, the air heavy with mildew. No chair, no blanket, no sign of welcome. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a long moment, breathing through the dampness and disbelief. Then I took out my phone, my fingers trembling, and started photographing every corner, the broken frame, the scattered belongings, the footprints in the mud. Every image felt like a record of betrayal. When I finished, I sat on the cold mattress and stared at the wall. It was strange how quickly grief could turn to silence, how silence could start to feel like armor. My sister's voice echoed faintly in my head. "You always fix everything, Evelyn, even when it's not your mess." But this time I wasn't sure I wanted to fix anything. This time I wanted proof. I used to think I understood Maya. When Daniel brought her home 10 years ago, she'd been all charm and laughter, all soft words and perfect smiles. I remember telling myself, finally he has someone who makes him happy. But little by little she'd redrawn the borders of my life, tiny cuts disguised as compromises. A new couch to replace the old one. A redecorated hallway. Then the guest room I once used as a study turned into their wellness space. Every time Daniel said, "She just wants to help." And I believed him, because that's what mothers do, we believe until belief breaks us. That night I lay on the mattress, the sound of rain on the roof, loud enough to drown my thoughts. I could hear their footsteps upstairs, the faint hum of the TV, the clink of glasses. The world went on as if I hadn't been erased. Around midnight I texted the only person I trusted enough to tell Leona she threw my things out. "Everything. I need to talk to you tomorrow." The dots blinked for a long time before the reply came. I knew something was wrong. "I'll be here at 8 a.m. Don't do anything rash." I didn't sleep. Instead, I scrolled through old photos, Daniel, as a boy holding up his first report card, grinning through missing teeth. My husband in his navy blues, standing tall and proud. My sister and me at the lake house, laughing with ice cream dripping down our hands. I looked at those faces and thought about how quickly love could fade when money and ego crept in. At dawn, the rain stopped. I opened the shed window and watched the sunlight creep over the lawn. My things were still there, sodden and broken. The sight didn't sting this time, it clarified. I took another set of photos, evidence not sentiment. Maya thought she'd humiliated me. She didn't realize she'd given me something far more dangerous: documentation. Around 7, the back door creaked open. I heard Daniel's footsteps in the yard. "Mom," his voice was tired, uneasy. I didn't answer. The door to the shed opened a crack and light spilled in. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence thinned. "Don't mind Maya," he said quietly. "She's stressed. The pregnancy, it's been hard." I raised an eyebrow. "Pregnancy," he nodded. "She didn't want to tell you yet." I wanted to laugh, but it came out hollow. "Then tell her to stop selling my memories to buy her nursery paint." He flinched. "She's not, Mom, please don't make this harder." "I'm not making it harder, Daniel," I said softly. "I'm just keeping count." He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't dare. He just mumbled, "I have to go," and left, closing the door with a soft squeal of rusted hinges. When his footsteps faded, I sat on the mattress, my phone heavy in my lap. I scrolled to my photo gallery: muddy frames, shattered glass, ruined quilt, and saved them all into a new folder titled Case Maya. For a long moment, I stared at the name. Then I opened a note and typed the first line of my new life: March 12th. Begin collecting evidence. Outside, the morning light grew brighter, revealing the yard in full ruin. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the woman who cried quietly in corners anymore. I was the woman who'd spent decades grading papers, tracking numbers, making lists, skills I'd never thought would save me. They would now. When I walked outside, the ground squished under my feet, and I looked toward the house that once felt like safety. The curtains upstairs fluttered. Maya's silhouette moved past the window phone pressed to her ear. She didn't glance down. She thought I was finished. Maybe that was her first mistake. By the time Leona's car pulled into the driveway, I was ready. My hands were clean, my voice steady, and my eyes dry. I greeted her with a small smile and said only one sentence: "It's time to make her regret underestimating me." That night, as darkness folded over the hills of Asheville, I lay on the mattress again, the faint smell of lavender from my ruined garden drifting through the cracked window. I whispered to the empty air, "If she wants war, I'll give her one with evidence, not anger." And for the first time in weeks, I didn't cry. I just smiled, because I finally knew what silence was, for it wasn't surrender. It was strategy. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maya's heel grinding down on the photo of my wedding day. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying. I turned on the small lamp, and the dim yellow light flickered over the walls of the shed. My phone buzzed a bank alert. Withdrawal $2,800 from Harper joint account. I frowned. That account hadn't been touched since my husband died. I opened the banking app, scrolling through the list, and my chest tightened. Spa packages. Furniture orders. Baby decor. A weekend stay at the Biltmore. And then one line that made me sit up straight: interior design by Maya Harper LLC, $7,200. The air felt cold suddenly. I whispered into the stillness, "She's spending my money." By sunrise, I was dressed and sitting at the small table by the window. The light came in soft and golden, washing over the notebook I'd kept from my teaching days. Every number, every receipt was written in perfect rows. I started copying the transactions by hand, writing the dates, vendors, and amounts. It calmed me, almost like grading essays again. Except this time, the red marks weren't corrections, they were warnings. When I reached the total, I stopped breathing for a moment. Over $15,000 gone in 2 months. And that was only what I could see. My pulse thudded in my ears. I shut the laptop, stood up, and went outside. The air smelled of wet pine and decay. Across the fence, my neighbor Leona was watering her azaleas. She looked up, startled. "Evelyn, you look pale, honey. You okay?" I walked closer and lowered my voice. "Leona, I need to ask you something. Did you see any deliveries at my house lately?" Her eyes flickered with worry. "Now that you mention it, yes. A few big boxes arrived last week. The man said they were baby furniture, but when I went to check, I saw brand names: Chanel, Gucci, Dior. Not exactly nursery stuff." I closed my eyes. "Of course. Designer goods, disguised as baby items. Maya was too confident, too sure I'd never question her. Leona reached through the fence and touched my arm. "Don't let her take what's yours, Evelyn." "I won't," I said quietly. "Not this time." I went back to the shed, pulled out my phone, and created a folder called Evidence. I added photos of the receipts, screenshots of the transactions, and notes of Leona's witness statement. Then I placed my hand on the notebook, whispered, "You've graded others for decades. Now grade the truth." At 8 o'clock, I walked to the front porch. The morning sun had dried the puddles, but the lawn still looked wounded. Maya's car was gone. Daniel's too. The silence felt like an invitation. I opened the door to the main house. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and new paint. My dining room, the one with the oak table I'd sanded by hand, was bare. The curtains were gone, replaced with pale fabric that didn't belong. On the counter lay an open envelope addressed to Harper Interiors. Inside was a printed invoice: deposit received for full remodel, client Daniel and Maya Harper, property 17 Elmwood Drive, my house, my address. I took a picture of the invoice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my pocket. Upstairs, the once familiar hallway looked foreign. Family photos had disappeared, replaced by glossy, abstract prints. My mother's embroidery, the one she made when I was born, was nowhere in sight. In its place hung a metallic sculpture, shaped like a question mark. The irony made me laugh under my breath. Then I saw the open laptop on the desk. Maya's login. Without thinking, I sat down and clicked on her email. My heart pounded as I read the subject lines: loan application submitted, Harper Home Equity, contract Harper Interiors redesign, invoice confirmation. There it was, my name listed as co-signer. Forged. I took pictures of every screen. The front door creaked behind me. I froze. Mom Daniel's voice drifted in. I turned slowly, schooling my face into calm. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. "You shouldn't be snooping around. Maya says you're stressed. You need rest." I stared at him for a long second. "Maya says a lot of things. Do you ever wonder if any of them are true?" "Mom, please," he sighed. "She's just trying to make a home for our baby." My voice dropped to a whisper. "Then why is she using my money to buy designer handbags?" He blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about? Check the account, Daniel. The one your father and I built with 40 years of work." He looked away. "She said you'd get paranoid. That you'd twist things." Paranoid. The word stung. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I'd learned that silence frightened liars more than shouting ever could. I picked up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked toward the door. "You tell your wife that every dollar she stole is documented. Every lie she's told is time-stamped." He didn't answer. I could feel his confusion, his fear, his loyalty pulling him in two directions. I left him standing there watching me like a stranger. Back in the shed, I sat at my small table, pulled out the notebook, and began a new page. March 13th. Begin tracking household changes. Gather proof before confrontation. My handwriting was steady, again precise. At noon, I brewed myself a cup of black tea. The warmth steadied my shaking hands. I stared out through the window toward the garden. The daffodils had survived the storm, their stems bending but unbroken. "So can I," I murmured. Then I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Caleb Wynn," came the calm voice on the other end. "Caleb, it's Evelyn Harper. You handled my husband's insurance years ago." "Mrs. Harper," he said, recognizing my tone. "It's been a long time." "What's wrong?" "I need to protect what's left," I replied simply. "Is this about family?" "It's always about family," I said, and that was enough for him. "I can see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring everything you have." "I will." When I hung up, the silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different, heavier, purposeful. I opened my folder on the phone and reviewed the evidence one more time. Every receipt, every withdrawal, every screenshot was a piece of the truth I would use. The door of the shed creaked open slightly. Leona peeked in holding a thermos. "I brought coffee. You look like you need it." "Thank you," I said softly. "Tomorrow's the first step." She nodded, setting the thermos down. "Be careful, Evelyn. People like her, they panic when the truth gets close." "I'm counting on it." When she left, I stared at the notebook, the faint scent of coffee rising in the air. Outside, the wind had calmed, and sunlight touched the muddy grass, turning it gold. I looked down at my hands, small, wrinkled but still steady. The same hands that had raised Daniel, paid off the mortgage, balanced the books for decades. Hands that would now balance justice. Before bed, I wrote one last line: March 14th meeting scheduled. Prepare all documents. Keep voice steady. Never cry in front of thieves. That night I lay awake on the mattress, the sound of crickets weaving through the silence. My chest still ached, but not from grief anymore. It was something sharper, cleaner: resolve. Maya thought she'd buried me under shame. She had no idea I was digging up evidence. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered into the dark, "Tomorrow I stop being afraid." Then I turned off the lamp, closed my eyes, and let the darkness become my ally. By the time I parked outside Caleb Wynn's law office in downtown Charlotte, the morning sky had cleared from its early drizzle. The air smelled of wet pavement and coffee from the cafe across the street. I sat in the car for a moment, both hands on the folder in my lap, watching people hurry past with umbrellas dripping. Ordinary lives, I thought. Mine used to be one of them. The office was on the second floor of a red brick building. The hallway buzzed faintly with the sound of printers and telephones. When I stepped inside, Caleb looked up from his desk, the same calm eyes I remembered from years ago. "Mrs. Harper," he said, rising to shake my hand, "it's been a long time." "It has," I answered, "and this time it's not about insurance, it's about theft." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Let's start with what you have." I opened the folder and laid out everything: printed bank statements, photos of the broken furniture, screenshots of online listings. Caleb's brows lifted slightly. "You've done your homework," he said. "I used to grade papers for 30 years, I said dryly. "Evidence isn't that different." He began flipping through the documents, scanning line by line. His pen tapped lightly on the desk as he muttered under his breath. "Withdrawals totaling $78,500 over 8 months. Unauthorized transactions. Forged cosigner on a home equity loan." He looked up at me. "You're certain you didn't sign this positive? That's not my handwriting and I don't use digital signatures." He nodded. "Then that's forgery. We'll keep this for record." And this document, he pointed to a printout: Harper Interiors Redesign. "This company belongs to your daughter-in-law. She set it up last year, claims it's her business, but I suspect it's just a funnel for my money." Caleb leaned back, arms crossed. "She's not just spending your funds, she's positioning herself legally. If that loan application went through, she could have tied your house to her business as collateral." I stared at him, the air seeming to thicken. "Collateral? You mean she could have lost my house?" He nodded. "If you hadn't noticed the forged document, yes." For a long moment I didn't speak, then I exhaled slowly. "She's smart," I said softly. "But not smarter than me." Caleb smiled faintly. "I believe you. Now let's talk about your property title." He pulled up a file on his computer. "You never transferred ownership to Daniel, correct?" "No. I told him I'd leave the house to him after I passed." "Nothing's been signed." "Good. That means you remain the sole owner. They're occupants by permission, legally tenants at will. Under North Carolina law, you can terminate that tenancy at any time, with proper notice." I let the words sink in. For months I'd felt powerless in my own home. Now suddenly I realized I still held the deed, literally and figuratively. Caleb leaned forward. "We'll send a formal notice soon. But before we act, we document everything: dates, amounts, witnesses. The more precise, the stronger your case." "I already have witnesses," I said. "My neighbor Leona. She saw deliveries, luxury goods labeled as baby decor. She's willing to testify." He nodded approvingly. "Perfect. Let's secure all digital records. Save those emails she left open on the laptop. Make sure you keep backups off-site." "I already did," I said. 3 copies, one on a flash drive, one on the cloud, one printed." Caleb smiled again, the kind of smile that said he didn't meet many women my age this prepared. "You're making my job easy." "I'm not trying to make it easy," I said quietly. "I'm trying to make it final." We spent another hour reviewing details. Caleb drew diagrams showing timelines of transactions, explaining how he'd classify each under financial abuse and property interference. I took notes, the old teacher in me coming alive again. Every word he said felt like a brick rebuilding the wall Maya had tried to tear down. Before I left, he summarized. Here's what we'll do. First, you change every password, bank, email, utilities. Second, freeze any joint accounts with Daniel. Third, send me the recording you mentioned from your home, the one where she talks about a loan or a baby. I nodded. You'll have it tonight. He looked at me seriously. Mrs. Harper, people like your daughter-in-law, they panic when they sense control slipping. Stay calm. Let her think you're defeated. Silence will make her careless. Silence, I repeated, almost smiling. That's something I've mastered. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun had come out. The wet pavement shimmered like glass. I stood there for a minute, feeling warmth touch my face. For the first time in months, my breath didn't catch halfway. Driving back to Asheville took 3 hours. The road curved through the Blue Ridge Mountains, each bend lined with wildflowers and mossy trees. The world felt wide again. As I drove, I thought about how revenge wasn't fire, it was discipline. By the time I reached home, the sky was blushing gold. Maya's car was in the driveway. Music drifted faintly from upstairs, something upbeat and sugary. I parked by the curb and sat for a moment, letting my pulse slow. Then I slipped the recorder into my coat pocket, pressed the red button, and walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside quietly. Maya's voice floated from the kitchen. Yes, babe, I told him the house is perfect for the loan. Once the papers are through, everything will be ours. A man's voice on speaker answered, low and casual. And she doesn't suspect, not a clue, she said, laughing softly. She's too busy sulking in her shed. I stood in the hallway, unseen, the recorder blinking red in my pocket. Every word was like a nail sealing her coffin. She turned, then spotting me in the doorway. Her smile faltered for half a second, then returned, smooth as ever. Oh, didn't hear you come in. I noticed, I said evenly. Daniel's working late. Do you want dinner? I made salmon. No thank you. I've eaten. Her eyes flicked to the folder in my hand. What's that? Old papers, I said. Memories I'm sorting. She smirked. You and your old papers. I smiled faintly. Yes. They're useful. People forget, they never lie. I turned and walked toward the shed, leaving her standing there confused. Inside, I sat on the edge of the mattress, pulled out the recorder and replayed her words. Once the papers are through, everything will be ours. The sound of her laugh filled the room. I felt no anger, just clarity. At my desk, I opened my laptop and created a new folder under Case Maya Audio Evidence. I labeled the file March 15, Loan Conversation. Then, I drafted an email to Caleb. Recording attached. Proof of intent to defraud. When I hit send, I leaned back and looked around the small, dim room. The walls were still cracked, the air still smelled of mildew, but suddenly it didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like an office. I picked up my notebook and wrote March 15th, meeting success. Begin phase 2, record everything. Let the evidence speak louder than emotion. Outside, dusk settled over the hills. Through the window I could see the faint outline of my lavender garden, wilted but alive. The same wind that once chilled me now felt like a quiet companion. I whispered to myself, people think time erases guilt, but time remembers it, just waits for proof. Then I switched off the light, let the darkness fill the room and smiled. Maya thought I was the past. She had no idea I was writing her future. Maya's laughter floated down the hallway that night, light and sweet but sharp at the edges. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing a mug, the recorder hidden under a dish towel near the sink. Daniel, she said upstairs, her voice playful, the baby's room will be perfect once your mom finally moves out. I already talked to the bank, they said we're good for the renovation loan. I froze, hands still under the water. The sound of her heels tapped across the hardwood like a metronome of deceit. Alone. On my house. I turned off the faucet and listened. Through the vent above the refrigerator, her voice carried muffled but clear enough. Trust me, babe, it's all set. She doesn't even understand how equity works. She'll sign whatever we tell her. My heart didn't race this time. It slowed. My grief had become precision. I dried my hands carefully, moved the towel an inch to check the blinking red light, and whispered to myself, "Lesson number 1, Maya, you never underestimate a teacher." The next morning I played the recording back while the kettle boiled. The sound of her voice filled the shed. I labeled the file Audio-2, Loan Discussion with Daniel. Then I took out my notebook, drew a neat box, and wrote, "Motive Property Acquisition via Fraudulent Consent." I smiled faintly. 30 years of teaching English, and I was finally living my own crime novel. I sent a short message to Caleb, new recording. Confirms intent to defraud. Will deliver copy Monday. His reply came 10 minutes later. Keep recording, do not confront. Silence is your weapon. Outside, the day broke bright and windless. Leona knocked on the shed door, carrying a basket of muffins. "You need to eat," she said, stepping inside. "I heard Maya ordered a shipment again yesterday. Looked expensive." I raised an eyebrow. "You saw the boxes, 3 of them. Labeled nursery decor." She lowered her voice. "Except they were from Bloomingdale's." I took a slow breath. "Thank you, Leona. I won't forget this." "You don't have to," she said gently. "Just don't let her forget you." When she left, I opened my laptop and checked the shared account again. More withdrawals. Another $4, 500. The note read, "Wellness Retreat Deposit." My fingers tightened around the mouse. Then something else caught my eye, a delivery invoice sent to our address. The description, "Positive Pregnancy Test Kit Prop Use Only." I clicked on the link. My pulse steadied, cold and certain. Prop use only. My throat tightened, but not from shock. From validation. She wasn't pregnant. She was pretending, weaving her web to claim sympathy and power. I printed the invoice and placed it neatly behind the financial records. On the tab I wrote, "Evidence #3, False Pregnancy Claim." That evening, Maya appeared at my door with an exaggerated smile. "Dinner's ready. Thought you might want to eat with us tonight." Her tone was honey-sweet, but her eyes glinted with calculation. I followed her into the kitchen, saying nothing. The table was set with candles, roast chicken, and red wine. She poured herself a glass, took a sip, and rested a manicured hand on her stomach. "I'm already feeling the baby kick," she said proudly. I glanced at her belly, flat as the countertop. 14 weeks now, right?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, almost 15. "How lovely," I said softly. "You'll have the ultrasound soon then." Her smile wavered just slightly before she recovered. "Of course. I'll bring you the pictures." I held her gaze a moment longer, then turned back to my plate. I didn't taste the food. I only memorized her words. When Daniel came home later that night, I was sitting outside on the porch steps, pretending to look at the stars. "You were quiet at dinner," he said, standing beside me. "I had a lot on my mind," I answered. He sighed. "Look, Mom, things are tense, but Maya's trying. She really wants you to be part of this." "Does she?" I said. "Or does she just want what's mine?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "She's not perfect, but neither am I," I interrupted gently. "But I've never lied to you." "Can she say the same?" He didn't reply. His eyes darted toward the house. "She's under a lot of stress." "The pregnancy," I cut him off quietly. "The pregnancy that doesn't exist." He turned sharply. What? I shook my head. "Nothing, Daniel. Just take care of your wife." I rose and walked back to the shed, leaving him frowning after me. Inside, I wrote everything down in my notebook word for word. Dinner conversation, baby kicking claim, follow-up required. Then I attached the printed invoice for the fake test kit to the same page. Each fact was a nail. Each lie she told was the hammer. Later that night, when the house had gone dark, I turned on the recorder again and slipped it into the pocket of my coat. I cracked open the window by the shed and waited. The wind carried faint voices from upstairs. "I told you," Maya whispered sharply. "I need a few more months. Once she signs everything, I'll fake the miscarriage. Everyone will feel sorry for us. We'll keep the house and no one will blame us." My breath caught, not from fear but from the cold precision of her cruelty. She was rehearsing her deceit like a script. I pressed the recorder closer to the window, catching every word. Daniel mumbled something inaudible, and then her voice turned icy. "If you mess this up, I swear I'll tell everyone your mom's losing her mind, that she's unstable." You want that on record at your job. I gripped the windowsill until my knuckles ached. That was her real weapon: shame. Not evidence, but reputation. When the voices faded, I closed the window slowly, careful not to make a sound. I sat on the bed staring at the blinking red light on the recorder. My reflection in the dark glass looked like a ghost, tired, silent, unbroken. At dawn, I brewed tea and reviewed the recording. Every sentence was clear, damning. I saved it to a flash drive labeled Audio-3, Miscarriage Plan. I placed it in the same folder as the others, then locked the box. For a while, I just sat there letting the sound of birds filter in. There was no more rage left, only focus. I'd taught hundreds of students about integrity, about consequence, about the way truth had a habit of rising, no matter how deep it was buried. Now I was about to show one more student how it worked in real life. Before heading out, I checked the mirror. My face was pale, but my eyes were steady. I adjusted my coat, slipped the recorder into the pocket again, and whispered. Lesson 2. Maya, lies might grow fast, but the truth has deeper roots. That afternoon, as the wind moved softly through the trees, I walked the perimeter of my property, taking photos of everything: the shed, the garden, the house. Not because I doubted what I'd find, but because I wanted a record of what was still mine. By nightfall, I sat at my small table again, writing the day's summary in blue ink. Evidence #4 audio of fabricated pregnancy plan. Evidence #5 coercion attempt against Daniel. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, quiet and steady. The flakes landed softly on the windowsill, melting as they touched the glass. I stared at them, my reflection faint beneath the frost. She thinks snow can hide her tracks, I whispered. But I've marked every step. I turned off the lamp, lay back on the mattress, and closed my eyes. The house above me slept in ignorance, but the recorder blinked red in the dark, patient and steady like justice, breathing quietly, waiting for its moment to speak. The morning sunlight fell across my notebook, turning the blue ink lines into rivers of proof. I had barely slept, but exhaustion didn't bother me anymore. It kept me sharp. On the table lay piles of receipts, printouts, and screenshots. Every dollar that disappeared now had a date, a place, and a name. I poured coffee into my chipped mug, the steam curling like a quiet warning. Numbers don't lie. People do. For hours, I matched the transactions with the items in the house that were missing. One by one, the picture formed. My husband's navy compass. Gone. My mother's silver brooch. Sold. The antique clock from the hallway, the one that had ticked through births, deaths, and storms, it wasn't in its place anymore. I searched online marketplaces using the keywords I knew too well: vintage Asheville compass. When the results appeared, my breath caught. There it was. My husband's compass, his initials still engraved on the back. R.H. Harper, 1,973. The listing was marked sold. $650. I took a screenshot, labeled it, Evidence 5, Compass, PNG, and set the laptop aside. For a second my hands trembled, not from anger, but from the weight of the memory. That compass had gone through 3 generations. It pointed sailors home, then guided me through widowhood. Now it was proof that my daughter-in-law had no soul. Leona came by mid-morning with her usual basket of biscuits, her eyes worried but bright. "You've been up all night again," she said, stepping inside. "I've been auditing," I said simply. "Old habits die hard." She glanced at the papers spread over the table. "You're turning grief into a weapon." "Not a weapon," I said, sliding a receipt toward her. "A record." She looked at the printout. "What's this transaction from Harper joint account to Maya Harper LLC? $9,800. Leona exhaled sharply. "My word. I found proof. She forged my signature on a home equity loan too," I added. "If I hadn't checked, I might have lost the house before the year ended." Leona pressed a hand to her chest. "She's dangerous, Evelyn. Don't face her alone." "I won't," I said. "I've got someone better than anger on my side now." Her eyes softened. "Caleb," I nodded. "He's drawing up documents. And he told me to stay quiet. Silence makes them careless." Leona nodded slowly. "Then you be careful, dear. Silence cuts both ways." After she left, I opened the notebook again. The pages were filled with numbers and handwriting neat enough to belong in a classroom. Each line represented a small betrayal, each total a confession. I reached the end of the list and wrote across the bottom margin, total $78, $500 withdrawn, not counting heirlooms. Then in smaller letters beneath it, justice pending. At noon, I checked my email. A new message from Caleb. Need digital copies of all files. Prepare folder for financial abuse claim. Will guide you through restitution process. Be discreet. I smiled. I had been discreet my entire life. Teachers learn early that the loudest power isn't the voice, it's the pause before the next sentence. I scanned the compass photo, the forged loan document, the luxury purchase invoices, and attached them to a folder titled Case, Maya, Financial, Fraud. Then I backed it up 3 times, hard drive, flash drive, and cloud. I closed the lid, exhaled, and whispered, "You thought you were stealing memories, Maya. You were writing your own indictment." Late in the afternoon, I brewed fresh coffee and dialed Caleb's number. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady as ever. "I've reviewed your files. You've built a case prosecutors would envy." "Good," I said quietly. "Then it's time to make her answer for it." "I agree," he said. "But timing is everything. Don't confront her yet. Let her think she's won. We'll file under financial elder abuse and property fraud. You can recover the money and she'll face criminal penalties for forgery." "Elder abuse," I repeated. The words tasted strange but satisfying. "I suppose I've earned that category." "It's not weakness, Mrs. Harper. It's a legal term for strength." "Then I'll take it," I said. "Tomorrow, we'll prepare the restitution demand, full amount plus emotional damages. You'll get your house back, every cent accounted for." I smiled faintly. "And what do I do until then?" "Keep documenting. Keep calm. And if she slips, record everything." "I've been doing that since she learned my Wi-Fi password," I said. Caleb laughed softly. "Then, she's already lost." When we hung up, the silence returned, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a held breath before victory. I gathered my notes, straightened each stack, and placed them in a manila folder labeled Financial Fraud Evidence, Harper Case. Then I looked around the small shed that had become my war room. On one wall, the sunlight fell on a faded photo of my wedding day. I picked it up carefully, brushed away a smear of dust, and set it next to the new evidence pile. 2 parts of my life, one built on love, the other on betrayal, side by side, both necessary. That evening, Daniel came by unannounced. His knock was hesitant. "Mom, can we talk?" I opened the door and stepped aside. "We can talk. But understand, I'm done begging to be heard." He sat on the old chair near the window, eyes red, hands clasped. "Maya told me you're planning to sue us." I kept my tone even. "I'm planning to protect myself." "She said you're confused. That you think she stole from you." "Think?" I asked, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "Here's a signed loan application with my forged signature. Does that look like confusion to you?" He stared at it for a long time. "Maya said you gave permission." I cut him off. "Stop letting her tell you what I said. Start reading what she's written." He slumped forward, elbows on his knees. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." "I believe you," I said softly. "But believing doesn't mean forgiving." "Not yet." He looked up, his voice breaking. "She said she did it for us. For the baby." I met his eyes. "Daniel, there is no baby." The silence that followed was deep, brittle. He didn't move, didn't breathe. "What? She's lying. I have proof." He shook his head slowly. "No, that's impossible. Ask her for the ultrasound then." He swallowed hard, stood up, and left without another word. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. The truth would follow him home soon enough. After he was gone, I sat for a while, listening to the crickets outside. I opened my notebook and wrote March 17th, confrontation with Daniel. Emotional reaction noted. No denial of financial misconduct. Then I added one more line, case progress inevitable. At nightfall, I organized all my evidence again, labeling each photo and document neatly. The shed light flickered and I smiled at the thought that even the bulb had seen too much. When the folder was complete, I closed it, tied it with a ribbon, and whispered, "You used my money to decorate your lies. Now I'll use your lies to decorate a courtroom." Before sleeping, I added one final entry to my ledger. Item Hashone, Navy compass, sold. Item #2 mother's quilt, destroyed. Item #3 respect, stolen. Item #4 justice, pending. Outside the night deepened. The wind carried the faint scent of lavender from the edge of the garden what little had survived. I leaned back, closed my eyes and felt the calm settle over me. The evidence was no longer just proof, it was armor. And tomorrow, when Caleb filed the papers, Maya would learn that the woman she tried to silence had been preparing every word of her downfall. Rain started before dawn, thin and cold drumming against the shed roof like a steady heartbeat. I sat by the small window, the folder of evidence on my lap, waiting for the clock to strike 8. My meeting with Caleb was at 9, but I wanted time to breathe, to remind myself why I was doing this. The house across the yard looked quiet, almost innocent in the gray light. Maya's car was gone. Daniel's too. Perfect. I picked up the manila folder, slipped it into my handbag and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet cedar and something metallic like anticipation. The drive to Charlotte felt longer than usual. Every curve of the mountain road seemed to echo the choices I'd made, small turns that led here. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, not from fear but from resolve. When I reached the city, I parked near the red brick building where Caleb's office sat. The lobby was warm, filled with the smell of paper and coffee. "Mrs. Harper," the receptionist greeted. "He's expecting you." Caleb stood when I entered his office. His suit was crisp, his tie slightly loosened like he'd already been through a long morning. "You made it safely?" he asked. "I did," I said. "And I brought everything." He motioned toward the table. "Let's go through it." I laid out the documents in careful order, the bank statements, the forged loan application, the photo of the sold compass, and the printed invoices for nursery decor. Caleb's eyes moved quickly, scanning, marking, making quiet notes. "You've done better work than most private investigators," he said with a faint smile. "Years of grading homework," I replied. "You learn to spot lies in handwriting." He looked up at me, serious again. "You understand what we're doing here, right? Once I file this, it becomes official. They'll be served with a notice of restitution and eviction. It will get ugly." I took a breath. "It's already ugly, Caleb. I just want it to be over." He nodded, then tapped his pen against the desk. "Let's start with ownership. This house is in your name solely." "Correct, yes. The deed's right there." He studied the document, then smiled slightly. "Then that's the foundation. You're the lawful owner. They're occupants by permission. You can terminate that permission at any time." The words hit me like sunlight through fog. Lawful owner. I had been made to feel like a guest in my own home for months, but legally, it was still mine. Caleb began writing notes on a legal pad. "Here's what I propose. We send a formal notice of tenancy termination and restitution demand. Rent will be set at $1,600 a month, backdated for the months they've lived without contributing. The $78,500 inches unauthorized withdrawals will be converted into a repayment schedule, 48 months, 2% interest. I'll add a clause if they miss one payment, the lease ends immediately." "Good," I said softly. "And my space, the back storage room?" he asked. "Yes. I want it locked under my control. No entry without consent." "Done." He wrote quickly, efficient and precise. Then he looked up. "You want to file it as civil, or do you want criminal charges for forgery?" I thought for a moment, staring out the window where the rain streaked down like glass veins. "Civil for now," I said. "I want them to face the law before I hand them to the police. Give them a chance to understand what they did." Caleb nodded slowly. "Mercy before justice." "Just clarity," I replied. "Mercy is what let them steal this far." He signed a few forms and slid them across the table. "I'll handle filing. All you need to do is authorize representation." I signed. My handwriting was steady, deliberate. Each letter felt like reclaiming territory. When it was done, he gathered the pages into a neat stack. "You'll receive copies by tomorrow. Once the letter is served, you stay calm. Let me handle any response." I stood, exhaling slowly. "And if they refuse to sign, then we file for eviction and a civil suit simultaneously. You have every advantage, Mrs. Harper. Don't let guilt soften it." "I won't," I said, and I meant it. As I reached for my coat, Caleb added quietly, "You know, in 20 years I've seen hundreds of family disputes, but few where one woman fights this cleanly. Most people want revenge. You just want justice." I smiled faintly. Revenge wastes time. Justice keeps records. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, letting light through in thin golden lines. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the damp air, then started walking toward the parking lot. My phone buzzed. A new message from Daniel. "Mom, Maya wants to have dinner tonight. She says she wants peace. Please come." Peace. The word made me laugh under my breath. That kind of peace was always prelude to negotiation or manipulation. Still, I typed back, "I'll be there." The drive home was quiet. The radio played soft jazz, one of those songs Daniel used to hum while doing homework at the kitchen table. It made something twist inside me, a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. But I didn't turn it off. I let it play, a reminder of the son I once knew. When I reached home, the lights were already on. Through the window, I saw the table set with candles and wine glasses. Maya always performed peace, like it was theater. I parked the car, straightened my coat, and walked in. "Evelyn," Maya said, smiling too brightly. "I'm so glad you came. Let's have a calm talk, okay?" "Of course," I said, taking a seat across from her. Daniel sat beside her, eyes darting nervously between us. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room. Maya poured wine into 3 glasses, her hand perfectly steady. "I just want to clear the air," she began. "We've all been tense lately, and I think misunderstandings got out of control." "Is that what you call forgery?" I asked, lightly taking a sip of wine without breaking eye contact. Her smile faltered. "You're mistaken. I never." "Please," I interrupted, setting the glass down. "We're all adults here. Let's speak honestly." Daniel's shoulders tensed. "Mom, please don't." "Daniel," I said quietly. "I'm fine. Let her talk." Maya crossed her arms, feigning calm. "I know you've been struggling since Richard passed. It's natural to feel possessive about the house. But it's time you let go. You deserve rest, not responsibility." "Rest," I repeated. "That's what you call being pushed into a storage room." Her tone hardened. "We thought it was best for everyone. You need space. The baby needs." "The baby," I said, cutting her off again. "Let's talk about that. How's the checkup? Everything normal?" Her lips twitched. "Fine," she said quickly. "Good," I murmured. "I'm sure your doctor will be glad to confirm that in court." Daniel's fork clattered against his plate. "Court?" I met his eyes. "I met with my attorney today. There's going to be a formal notice. A lease. A repayment plan." Maya let out a short, sharp laugh. "You can't be serious." "I'm more serious than you've ever been." She leaned forward, voice rising. "You think a few papers will make me kneel? This is my house too. I've made it better, cleaner, brighter." "You sold my history to pay for it," I said. "That's not better. That's theft dressed in satin." Daniel's hands shook. "Maya, stop. Just stop." She glared at him, then at me. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Maybe," I said calmly. "But at least I'll regret it in my own home." The room went silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. I stood, pushing my chair back slowly. "I'll leave the letter on the kitchen counter tomorrow morning. You'll have 48 hours to sign. If not, the sheriff will deliver the rest." Maya opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Daniel stared at the table, his jaw trembling. As I turned to leave, I said softly, "You should both eat. It's bad manners to let food go cold." When I stepped outside, the wind hit me like a baptism. The air was cool, sharp, honest. I walked toward the shed, the sound of the rain starting again behind me. Inside, I sat on the bed, took off my coat, and looked at the faint reflection in the window. I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't broken either. I picked up my notebook and wrote the date in neat script, March 18th. Dinner confrontation complete. Formal notice drafted. Peace pending. Then beneath it I added one line more. Justice begins quietly, but it never leaves once it arrives. The knock came just before midnight, 3 short raps against the shed door, soft but hurried. I sat up instantly. The lamp on my desk still burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. "Mom, it's me," Daniel's voice whispered from outside. I opened the door and there he stood, hair disheveled, eyes red, shoulders sagging under a weight far heavier than exhaustion. He stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just stood there breathing hard, like a man who'd been running from the truth, and finally had nowhere left to go. "I can't sleep," he said, finally. "She won't stop talking. She says you're trying to destroy us." I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Sit, Daniel. You look like a ghost." He sat, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what to believe anymore." "You believe what's in front of you," I said softly. I reached for the manila folder on the table and slid it toward him. "Here. Look." He hesitated before opening it as if afraid of what he'd find. The papers rustled, bank statements forged, signatures, invoices, photos of the sold compass, even screenshots of Maya's fake pregnancy order. He scanned the pages slowly, lips moving as if reading aloud in his head. When he reached the last document, he froze. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It's all real," I said. "You've seen the house change around you piece by piece. You thought it was renovation, it was erasure." He set the papers down and buried his face in his hands. "God, what have I done?" I waited. The silence between us stretched long and heavy. Finally I said, "You didn't do this, Daniel. But you let it happen." He looked up, eyes shining wet. "She said it was temporary. That we'd pay you back. That it was for the baby." "There is no baby," I said quietly. "It was never real." He shook his head in disbelief. "No, she showed me the test." "Ordered online," I interrupted. "Prop use only. You can check the receipt yourself." He leaned back in the chair, eyes unfocused, lips trembling. "I thought she loved me." I sighed. "She loved what you could give her. Some people marry affection, others marry opportunity." He didn't answer. His shoulders began to shake. When he finally spoke, his voice was small like a boy again. "I didn't protect you. Dad would hate me for that. Your father would understand," I said gently. "He made mistakes too. We all do. What matters is what we do next." He nodded slowly. "What do you want me to do?" "Sign the lease. Pay what's owed, and stop defending her lies." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'll do it. Tomorrow, I'll sign whatever Caleb brings." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint patter of rain against the roof. Then Daniel whispered, "She'll leave me if I do this." "Then let her," I said simply. "You can't build a life on rot." He looked at me, then really looked like he was seeing me for the first time in years. "You're stronger than I thought," he said. "I had to be," I replied. "Strength is the rent women my age pay to survive." He managed a weak laugh, then rubbed his face. "I don't know if I'm brave enough to face her." "You will be," I said. "Because you'll have truth on your side now." He stood, running a hand through his hair. "I'll tell her in the morning." As he reached the door, I called softly, "Daniel." He turned. "I still love you," I said. "But love doesn't mean silence anymore." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I know. I love you too, Mom." When he left, I sat in the quiet, listening to his footsteps fade across the yard. The wind had picked up, rattling the window pane. I poured myself a cup of cold tea and leaned back in the chair. The shed smelled faintly of dust and lavender. For the first time, I felt something close to relief, not joy, but the sense that maybe the tide had turned. I was about to turn off the lamp when I heard a creak from the main house. Then another. Soft footsteps upstairs. I froze. It was too late for Daniel to be back. I reached for the small recorder on the shelf, switched it on, and waited. Through the paper-thin wall, a faint voice drifted down Maya's. "I told you," she hissed into her phone, "just a few more weeks. Once that old woman signs the papers, I'll say I lost the baby. Everyone will pity us. The house will be ours and no one can touch us." My fingers tightened around the recorder. Her voice was sharp, confident, dripping with contempt. Then came a pause and a man's voice, low and distant, on speaker. "You sure she'll fall for it? She's 70, Maya scoffed. "She still uses paper bills. Of course she'll fall for it." The words hung in the air like poison. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Every syllable etched itself into the recorder's memory. "I told Daniel everything's fine," she continued. "He's too weak to question me. By the time he figures it out, we'll have the deed transferred." The call ended with a laugh, cold, triumphant. I sat there in the dark, the red light blinking faintly on the recorder. For a long time I couldn't move. Then slowly I stood, placed the recorder on the desk and whispered, "You just signed your own sentence, Maya." The rain thickened outside, hammering against the roof, but inside the shed it was silent except for the ticking of the small clock on the wall. I poured another cup of tea, hands steady. The fear I'd felt before was gone. In its place was something colder, certainty. Before bed, I wrote a single line in my notebook, March 19th, recorded full admission of fraud. Maya unaware, evidence secure. Then underneath it, I added, let her keep talking, truth has perfect hearing. I left the recorder charging on the table and lay back on the mattress, the blanket pulled to my chin. The sound of the rain was rhythmic, steady, almost like applause. Somewhere upstairs, Maya believed she was winning. At dawn, the light filtered in gray and soft. I woke to the faint hum of the heater and the distant noise of a car door slamming. Through the window I saw Daniel walking toward his car, shoulders squared, moving with new purpose. I didn't call out. He didn't look back. I sipped the last of my cold tea and opened the notebook again. The edges of the pages were smudged from my fingers, ink slightly faded in spots. Every entry told the same story, a woman erased, then reborn. Before closing the book, I wrote one last note at the bottom of the page. Next step, deliver evidence to Caleb. Let the law speak where love failed. Then I folded my scarf around my neck, stepped outside into the chill morning air, and whispered toward the house. You wanted control, Maya. Now you'll learn what real power looks like. The wind carried my words away, but I didn't need her to hear them. Soon the court would. When I got out of the hospital, the world looked too bright to trust. The sun pressed against the car windows as Luke drove Hannah in the passenger seat, watching every breath I took. The doctor's warning still echoed in my head, no stress, no confrontation, at least 90 days. But how does a woman erase stress when her home itself has become a wound? The closer we got to the neighborhood, the heavier the air felt. My chest throbbed in dull waves, but I said nothing. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The house appeared just beyond the turn 17 Elmwood Drive, and at first I thought we had the wrong address. The white gate was open, the flower beds bare. The Harper Home sign, my husband carved in 1993, was gone. Even the porch chair, my husband's chair, had vanished. Luke stopped the car. Mom, I pushed the door open and stepped out, boots sinking into the damp ground. There were tire marks cutting across the yard as if someone had tried to scrape away the past itself. I walked slowly toward the porch. The air smelled of rain and bleach. The lock on the front door was new, silver, shiny, and wrong. Where's everything? Hannah whispered. I touched the doorknob. It didn't turn. Inside, I said quietly. And not ours anymore. Luke pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police. Don't, I said. Let's call Caleb first. This will work better in writing than in shouting. We stood there a long time, the three of us, in silence. Then the curtain in the front window twitched, just a flutter but enough. Someone was inside. I turned away, every movement slow and deliberate, and walked back to the car. Take pictures, I told Luke. Every corner, every missing piece. As he lifted the camera, I looked at the lawn where my mother's lavender used to grow. Only muddy roots remained, the color drained from the earth. Back in the car, my pulse began to even out. She thinks she's erased me, I said, almost to myself. But she's only drawn her own confession. Hannah's phone buzzed. It's Caleb, she said, putting it on speaker. Mrs. Harper, his calm voice filled the car. Leona already called me. The house has been emptied. Don't enter. We'll file it as illegal property interference. I'll have officers there within the hour to document everything. Thank you, I said. You sound composed, he said. I'm past rage, I replied. Now it's arithmetic. He paused for a moment. You're stronger than you know. I'll handle the paperwork. Just rest. Rest later, I said softly. Justice doesn't nap. After we hung up, Hannah looked at me carefully. Mom, you need to stay somewhere safe. Come home with me for a few weeks. I will, I promised. But first, one last stop. 10 minutes later, we pulled into a small cafe called Maple and Steam. The windows glowed warm against the cold afternoon light. A single woman sat by the window, her hair pulled back, a beige envelope on the table in front of her. Even from outside I recognized the tilt of her chin. Lorraine Pierce, Maya's mother. Hannah frowned. "Mom, why are we here?" "Because she called me," I said, "and something tells me she's not here for coffee." I walked in slowly. The bell over the door chimed and Lorraine looked up. For once her face wasn't painted in confidence. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips trembling. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Evelyn." "Lorraine." I sat. "You look tired." "I am," she said softly. "And you look hollow. Grief and betrayal tend to do that." She nodded and pushed the envelope toward me. "You deserve to know everything." I stared at it but didn't touch it yet. "Everything." Her voice cracked. "She can't have children, Evelyn. She hasn't been able to for years." The words sank like stones into the quiet between us. Lorraine swallowed hard. The pregnancy, it was a lie. She bought a fake positive test online. I told her it was wrong, but she said if I tell the truth I lose him. If I keep lying, I keep the house. My fingers trembled as I finally opened the envelope. Inside were medical reports from a fertility clinic in Raleigh dated 2019. Patient, unable to conceive naturally. IVF, unsuccessful. Attached were screenshots of texts Maya's messages to her mother. "I'll say I'm 3 months pregnant. No one verifies that stuff." Another one. "Once I get the deed, I'll fake a miscarriage. People will feel sorry. Even the old woman will." For a long moment I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt. I closed the folder slowly and looked up at Lorraine. "Why are you showing me this now?" Tears streaked her face. "Because I'm done covering for her. I thought she'd grow out of it, this hunger for control. But she's pulling everyone into her pit, including my husband, including your son." I sat back feeling something colder than shock, a strange pity. "You raised her," I said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "And I failed her. But you still have a chance to save Daniel." I nodded slowly. "Then I'll use this. Not to ruin her, but to free him." Lorraine reached across the table, gripping my hand. "Promise me something," she said. "Don't destroy her completely. She's my daughter no matter what she's become." I met her eyes. "I won't destroy her, Lorraine. The truth will." We sat in silence for a long time, two mothers united by loss, divided by bloodlines. When I finally stood, I slipped the envelope into my bag. "You've done the right thing," I told her. "No," she said softly. "Just the late thing." Outside, the wind had turned cold again. Hannah waited by the car, arms crossed, eyes questioning. I handed her the envelope. "Read it," I said. She flipped through the papers, her expression tightening with each page. "Oh my God," she whispered. She's insane." "No," I said, voice steady. "She's desperate. Desperation's just cowardice with lipstick." We got in the car and drove home in silence. The clouds hung low, heavy with unshed rain. I rested the envelope on my lap, the weight of it pressing into me like a heartbeat. Halfway home, Hannah spoke. "Mom, what will you do?" "I'll show Daniel," I said. "And I'll let him decide which truth he wants to live with." When we reached the edge of town, the first drops of rain began to fall again, pattering softly against the windshield. I looked out at the wet blur of trees and rooftops. My body was still weak from the hospital, but my mind had never been clearer. "People think lies buy them time," I said quietly. "But they only rent it. And rent always comes due." Hannah reached over, squeezing my hand gently. "You're not alone in this, Mom." "I know," I said, staring at the envelope. "But some wars you have to end yourself." As we turned onto the main road, the cafe lights disappeared behind us, and the rain fell harder, washing the dust from the windshield the same way truth was about to wash every lie clean from my life. I waited until the house was quiet before calling him. Daniel picked up on the second ring, his voice small and tired. "Mom, come alone," I said. "No one else. I need to show you something." He hesitated. "Maya's asleep. What is this about? You'll see." He arrived half an hour later, shoulders hunched under his jacket, hair damp from the rain. The porch light caught the dark circles beneath his eyes. He looked like a man half emptied. I opened the door, and the smell of wet earth followed him in. I didn't offer him tea. I just gestured to the table where the envelope Lorraine had given me lay waiting. "Sit," I said. He sat, glancing at the envelope, as if it might bite him. "Is this about the papers Caleb sent?" "No," I said. This is about your wife. He exhaled sharply. Mom, please, I can't. I slid the envelope across the table. Read it. He hesitated. Then, with slow, trembling hands, he lifted the flap and pulled out the first page. His eyes moved across the lines, confusion, shifting to disbelief, then to horror. When he reached the screenshots, his lips parted but no sound came out. This is fake, he whispered. It isn't, I said quietly. It's from her mother. He looked up sharply. Lorraine, she gave it to me yesterday. She couldn't keep hiding the truth. He looked down again at the medical records, the texts, the invoices. She can't have children, he said flatly, reading the words aloud like a sentence he didn't believe. IVF, unsuccessful. Alternative treatments recommended. He flipped through another page and stopped at the text message, I'll buy a fake test. Nobody checks those. Daniel's hand went to his mouth. Oh my God. I watched him silent. He looked young again, like the boy who once ran to me when he broke a window, terrified I'd stop loving him. He set the papers down slowly. I thought she was different. That she needed care. I thought, if I just kept peace, everything would get better. She didn't want peace, I said softly. She wanted ownership. He stared at the papers again. She told me I'd never understand what she went through. That I'd make her miscarry if I kept arguing. I reached across the table and touched his hand. You didn't make her lose anything, Daniel. She never had it. He flinched as if the words were a physical blow. I wanted a family, he whispered. A real one. You have one, I said. It's just smaller now. He took a deep breath, then looked at me with eyes wet and red. What do I do? Start by telling the truth, I said. To yourself, to Caleb, to the court. You don't have to fix her. You just have to stop helping her hurt you. He nodded slowly, almost like he was waking from a long sleep. I should have stopped this earlier. Guilt won't clean it up, I said. Only action will. He wiped his face with his sleeve. She said you were making things up. That you were losing your memory. I believed her. I leaned back, letting his words settle. It's easier to believe comfort than confrontation. His mouth twisted. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't need sorry, I said. I need you to choose. Choose yes. You can stay in the lie with her or you can help me end it. He looked at the envelope again. If I leave her, she'll destroy me. She already has, I said. The only difference is, this time you get to decide what's left standing. He dropped his head into his hands, silent. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows in steady rhythm. After a while, he whispered, I'll go to Caleb tomorrow. I'll sign everything. I'll tell him I knew nothing, that I'll cooperate fully. Good, I said. We'll make it right. He lifted his head. What about her? She'll have her chance to speak. But this time her words will be weighed against proof. He nodded weakly. I still don't understand how she could do it. Some people are born without the capacity for truth, I said quietly. They decorate their emptiness with lies. He gave a small broken laugh, then covered his eyes again. You always know how to make it sound poetic. 30 years of teaching, I said. It's the only language I trust. He stood hesitating by the door. Mom, he said softly, after all this, do you still love me? Always, I said. But love doesn't mean I'll protect you from the truth anymore. He nodded, swallowed hard, and left. When the door closed, I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, my fingers steady, and placed it in the lockbox with the rest of the evidence. The sound of the latch clicking was oddly soothing. The house above was quiet for a few minutes. Then faintly I heard footsteps, quick, nervous. Maya's voice drifted down through the floorboards. Who were you talking to? I turned off the lamp and stayed still. Daniel's voice muffled. My mother. What about? About the lease. A pause. Then her tone sharpened. You didn't tell her anything, did you? No. Another pause, longer this time. Then softly, Maya said, if she keeps pushing, I'll say she hit me, that she's unstable. My breath caught, but I didn't move. You wouldn't, Daniel said. Don't test me, she hissed. You think I'll lose everything because of her. She's the reason you're weak. I made you strong. Don't forget that. Silence. Then the sound of a door slamming. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the rain and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then I reached for my recorder, pressed record, and whispered the date. March 20th, Daniel knows. Maya's preparing her defense through lies. She plans to accuse me of abuse. I set the recorder down and leaned back. The exhaustion finally reached me thick and heavy. But beneath it was something steady relief. The hardest part wasn't collecting evidence. It was watching my son's blindness crack open into sight. Just before dawn, I heard footsteps again, softer this time. A knock. Mom, I sat up. Yes, Daniel's voice was low. You were right, she's gone. Packed a bag and left after our argument. Good, I said. He sounded uncertain. Do you think she'll come back? Only if she thinks she still has something to take. There was a pause. Then she'll come, he said quietly. I looked out the window toward the pale line of morning light breaking over the trees. Let her. This time she'll find more than she bargained for. He didn't answer, but I could hear his breath catch before he whispered, "Thank you, Mom." When his footsteps faded, I lay back down, my heart pounding steady. I stared at the ceiling until the first streaks of dawn touched it gold. I whispered to the silence, "The truth is awake now. Let her try to sleep through that." The courthouse smelled like rain and old paper. I sat behind the defense table, my palms flat against the folder labeled Harper vs. Harper. Daniel sat beside me silent, his eyes fixed on the table as if afraid to look up. Across the aisle, Maya adjusted her blazer, her lipstick too bright for the gray morning. She looked every bit the woman she wanted the world to believe, composed, innocent, victimized. I wondered if she could feel the weight of the truth already circling her. Caleb leaned toward me. "Remember, Mrs. Harper," he whispered, "you don't need to win the argument. You just need to stay calm." "I've been calm for a lifetime," I murmured. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The gavel struck once sharp as thunder. "Court is in session," the clerk announced. Maya's lawyer went first, a young man with too much gel in his hair and too little experience. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my client has endured emotional distress and harassment at the hands of her elderly mother-in-law. She was unjustly evicted, financially exploited, and accused of crimes she did not commit." I felt Caleb's hand twitch slightly beside me, signaling patience. "Let him talk." The lawyer continued flipping a page for effect. "This case isn't about property, it's about compassion. My client is an expectant mother forced from her home with nowhere to go." "Expectant," I whispered under my breath. The word made the corners of Caleb's mouth tighten. When it was our turn, Caleb stood slowly, calm as a tide rolling in. "Your Honor, this case is about evidence, not emotion. We will show documented withdrawals totaling $78,500 from accounts belonging solely to Mrs. Evelyn Harper. We will show property sold without consent. We will show a forged home loan application. And we will play recordings of the plaintiff herself admitting her actions." The room stilled. Even the young lawyer stopped fidgeting with his pen. Caleb walked to the evidence table, placed the first document down, and said, "Exhibit A, bank statements. Exhibit B, notarized handwriting analysis confirming forgery. Exhibit C, audio recording of the plaintiff stating, quote, 'Once the old woman signs everything, I'll fake a miscarriage and the house will be ours.'" Maya flinched visibly. "Permission to play the recording," Caleb said. The judge nodded. "Proceed." The room filled with Maya's voice. "Once that old woman signs, I'll say, 'I lost the baby.' Everyone will pity us. The house will be ours and no one can touch us." A sound left the back of the courtroom, half gasp, half disbelief. Maya's mother Lorraine sat near the last row, her face pale, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. When the recording ended, Caleb spoke softly. "No further commentary, Your Honor. The plaintiff has already spoken for herself." Maya's lawyer jumped up. "That recording was obtained without consent, it's inadmissible." Caleb turned his voice smooth as polished stone. "North Carolina is a one-party consent state council. My client was the homeowner. The recording is valid." The judge's gaze sharpened. Objection overruled. Maya's lawyer sat down hard, his confidence evaporating. Then came the soft sound of a chair moving in the back. Lorraine stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling, I have something to add." The judge frowned. "You are Lorraine Pierce, the plaintiff's mother." Caleb stepped forward. "Your Honor, Mrs. Pierce has material evidence." We request she be allowed to testify. The judge nodded once. Proceed. Lorraine approached the stand slowly, clutching an envelope. Her voice was thin but clear. My daughter lied, she began. She can't have children, she hasn't been able to for years. These are her medical records, and these she held up printed screenshots are her messages to me admitting the deception. The young lawyer scrambled to his feet. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Sit down, the judge said firmly. Lorraine's hands shook as she opened the envelope and laid the papers out. I defended her for too long. But I won't lie anymore. She used her husband, her family, and this woman she turned to me as stepping stones for her greed. Maya's voice cracked. Mom, stop. Lorraine turned toward her daughter. No, Maya. You stop. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Caleb gathered the documents and handed them to the bailiff. Your Honor, this corroborates the fraud claim. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Maya. Mrs. Harper, do you deny any of this? Maya's lips trembled. They're twisting everything. My mother's jealous. That old woman manipulated everyone. The judge banged her gavel. Enough. Maya fell silent, tears streaming down her face, the act finally wearing thin. Caleb spoke softly. Your Honor, we request a ruling affirming Mrs. Evelyn Harper's full ownership of the property, the validity of the repayment agreement, and restitution for financial damages. The judge nodded slowly, reviewing the papers. Then she looked at Maya again. The court finds in favor of the defendant, Mrs. Evelyn Harper. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed. The lease and repayment agreement are recognized as lawful. The evidence of forgery and financial fraud will be referred to law enforcement for further investigation. The gavel struck twice. Final. I didn't cheer. I didn't even exhale. I just sat there feeling the years of silence settle into peace. Daniel's hand found mine under the table, trembling. I gave it a small squeeze. Across the room, Maya sat motionless. Her mascara ran in thin black rivers down her cheeks. Lorraine was crying too, but quietly, the kind of tears that come when the truth finally wins but leaves ruin behind. When the judge left, the room erupted in whispers. Caleb leaned toward me. It's done, he said. I nodded slowly. No, I whispered. It's beginning. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. The courthouse steps were slick from the morning rain. Lorraine stopped beside me, clutching her purse to her chest. Evelyn, she said softly, I'm sorry. I looked at her, and for the first time I saw not the woman who'd defended her daughter, but a mother drowning in her own failure. You don't owe me an apology, I said. You owed it to her. And now you've given it. She nodded, her chin trembling. I never thought it would come to this. It always comes to this, I said quietly. Truth is patient. It waits for everyone. Daniel joined me at the curb. His face was pale, his voice low. Mom, I don't know what to say. Then don't, I said. Just do better next time. He nodded, blinking hard. I will. Caleb stepped out behind us holding a small packet of papers. You'll get the full restitution order by mail. The rest is just procedure. Thank you, I said. For everything. He smiled faintly. You did most of the work, Mrs. Harper. I just gave your silence a microphone. As I walked to the car, the air felt lighter, washed clean. The courthouse stood behind me like a monument to endurance. For months I had lived beneath lies. Now, with one sound of the gavel, the air finally cleared. Before getting in, I looked back once more. Maya stood on the courthouse steps, face hidden in her hands, her mother beside her speaking softly. I didn't hate her. I didn't even pity her. I just felt distance, final and quiet. As the car pulled away, I whispered to the window, justice doesn't shout. It whispers. And today, it spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. When I woke the next morning, the world was silent in a way it hadn't been for months. No footsteps overhead. No doors slamming. No voices arguing through thin walls. The house was mine again, but it felt too still, like a stage after the audience had gone home. The victory from the courthouse still hung in the air, but beneath it was exhaustion, deep and thick. I moved slowly, touching the banister, the kitchen counter, the door frame, as if reintroducing myself to my own life. The phone rang around 9. Caleb's voice was calm, steady as ever. The restitution order has been processed, Mrs. Harper. The full repayment is binding, and the property title is secure. You can rest now. Rest. The word sounded foreign. Thank you, Caleb, I said softly. You did the hard part, he replied. Now comes the quiet. But quiet was its own kind of challenge. When I hung up, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. The walls still carried faint shadows, where paintings used to hang the floor lighter, where furniture once stood. Absence had its own color. I spent the morning cleaning. It wasn't just about dust, it was ritual. I wiped every surface, scrubbed every mark, rearranged what was left. The air began to smell like lemon and soap instead of tension. When I opened the windows, the cool April breeze swept through, carrying the sound of the pine trees outside. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Lorraine standing there. She looked older than I remembered from the courthouse, her hair tied back, her coat too big for her. May I come in? She asked quietly. I stepped aside. Of course. She walked in, slowly glancing around like she was afraid to breathe. I just wanted to see you, she said, to thank you. You could have destroyed her completely. You didn't. I didn't need to, I said. She did that herself. Lorraine nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. She's under probation now. Counseling, community service, restitution payments. Maybe it'll teach her something, maybe, I said. Or maybe the lesson was for us, not her. She looked at me for a long time. You really don't hate her, do you? Hate? I shook my head. Hate's too heavy. I've carried enough. She smiled sadly. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. No, I said, just older, and tired of being quiet. We sat at the table and shared tea in silence. There was nothing left to prove, nothing to hide. Two mothers, both scarred, both still standing. When she left, she squeezed my hand and whispered, You gave me courage, Evelyn. Maybe now I can try again with her someday. Someday, I said softly, though I wasn't sure I believed it. After she left, I stood by the window watching her small figure walk down the driveway. The rain had stopped. Sunlight shimmered through the wet branches. I thought about all the years I'd spent teaching children to tell the truth, to own their mistakes, and how I'd nearly forgotten that lesson myself. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by. He looked thinner, but clearer somehow, like a fog had finally lifted. Mom, he said, stepping inside carefully, I've been approved for a new apartment downtown. It's small, but it's mine. I smiled faintly. Then it's perfect. He handed me a folded envelope. First repayment. I wanted to bring it myself. I took it but didn't open it. Daniel, the money isn't what matters. I know, he said, but I need to do this. He sat down at the table, glancing around the room. It feels different in here. It is, I said. It finally breathes again. He hesitated. I'm going to therapy, you know. Caleb recommended someone. I need to understand how I let it all happen. I reached across the table, resting my hand over his. Understanding isn't punishment, Daniel. It's how you grow. He smiled weakly. I keep hearing your voice in my head. Check your math, check your heart. That sounds like me, I said, laughing softly. For the first time in months, we shared quiet without tension. He stayed for dinner, just soup and bread, and left before sunset. When I hugged him goodbye, his shoulders didn't tremble the way they used to. After he drove away, I walked out to the garden. The lavender had started to bloom again, small but defiant. I knelt down and ran my fingers through the soft leaves. You survived, I whispered. So did I. The sound of crickets filled the air. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 6 times. I closed my eyes and let the cool evening wrap around me. Inside, I opened the envelope Daniel had given me. The check was for more than what was required, with a note attached, for everything you lost, and everything I'm still learning. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my ledger between the pages where I'd once written all the damage. Maybe it was time to start a new section, restoration. That night I sat in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea, the lights dim, the house humming softly in the dark. I thought about the word freedom. Everyone imagines it feels light, but it doesn't. It has weight, the weight of decisions, of forgiveness, of carrying on when there's nothing left to prove. I pulled out my old notebook, the one that had started it all, and wrote on a fresh page. Freedom isn't forgetting, it's remembering without pain. Then under it, justice served. Peace in progress. The pen paused for a moment before I added one last line. Tomorrow, plant more lavender. The clock ticked gently in the background. The house smelled faintly of tea and lemon. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into soft darkness. Outside, the moon hung low and clear over the pine trees, washing the yard in pale silver. I walked to the window and pressed my hand to the glass. For the first time in a long time, I felt no anger, no ache, just the quiet certainty that I had come through the fire with my dignity intact. Justice wasn't loud, it didn't roar, it whispered. And I could finally hear it steady and kind, somewhere between the rustle of lavender and the slow rhythm of my own heart. Spring came early that year. The air in Asheville carried the smell of wet soil and lavender buds pushing through. Every morning I woke to birdsong instead of tension, to sunlight instead of suspicion. The house no longer felt haunted, it felt lived in again. I started each day by walking barefoot through the garden, the earth cool under my feet, dew clinging to my toes. The lavender bed had survived the winter against all odds. New shoots had appeared green and defiant, growing from the same ground where my memories had once been thrown out like trash. I knelt down to plant a few more. My hands sank into the dirt, steady, unhurried. You and I whispered to the small purple buds we've both learned to bloom after being buried. Inside, the kitchen smelled of bread and lemon. The house had taken back its voice, creaks and sighs that sounded like home again. On the counter sat a small stack of envelopes, Daniel's repayments punctual and neat, each with a note inside. Month 9 still learning. Month 10 starting to breathe again. I didn't cash them right away. I kept them as reminders that growth takes time. Around noon the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Hannah and Luke stood there holding a wooden sign. It was freshly carved, polished smooth. We thought it was time, Luke said, smiling. Together they held it up. It read, Harper Home, since 1993. Tears stung my eyes. Your father would have liked that, I said. We know, Hannah whispered. That's why we used the same kind of oak he loved. They spent the afternoon helping me hang it over the porch. The sunlight caught the gold letters glinting off the varnish. When we stepped back, I couldn't stop smiling. It's not just a sign, I said. It's a promise. Later, Daniel arrived carrying a box. His eyes were tired but calm. A small gift, he said, setting it on the table. Inside was a brand new rocking chair, walnut, polished, elegant. I know it's not the same as Dad's, he said softly, but I wanted to give you something that stays. I ran my fingers along the curved armrest. This one will have its own story. He smiled faintly. I think that's the point. That evening after dinner, we sat on the porch. The new sign above us, the rocking chair creaking softly beneath me, lavender scent drifting in the wind. Luke lit candles on the table, their glow flickering across the wooden boards. Hannah read one of her aunt's old poems, the sister I'd lost at the beginning of this whole mess. Her voice trembled on the last line. Home is not the walls that hold you, it's the peace that doesn't leave when others do. We sat in silence afterward, watching the sky turn amber. For the first time in a year, laughter came easily. When they left, I stood on the porch long after their car disappeared, the air humming with spring's quiet warmth. Later that night I made tea and sat at my desk. The lamp cast a soft golden pool over the papers. On top of the stack lay my old will, creased, outdated, full of names that no longer belonged to the life I lived now. I took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. To my children, this home will remain yours, to share equally under one condition: respect must always be paid, just as taxes must. Love is not free when it costs someone else their dignity. I paused, then added another paragraph. To the women who come after me, I leave a small fund to help those who've suffered financial abuse in silence. Use it to stand taller, speak louder, and never believe age makes you powerless. When I finished, I folded the papers and placed them in the wooden box that once held my mother's wedding scarf. The same scarf Maya had thrown into the yard. I'd cleaned it months ago, pressed it gently, and now it smelled of lavender oil. I laid it over the will like a benediction, then closed the lid. The rain started outside, light and steady. I opened the window, letting the cool breeze sweep through. The drops pattered against the porch roof, the rhythm soft, forgiving. I picked up my notebook, the one that had followed me through every chapter of this battle, and turned to a clean page. My handwriting came slow but sure. April 17th, 1 year later. The house is quiet. The lavender is blooming. The woman I used to be is gone. The one who remains finally knows how to live without fear. I put the pen down and looked around. The walls glowed under the lamplight, the air full of warmth and faint music from the radio. A piano song played something slow and familiar. I leaned back in the chair and let it fill the silence. Before bed, I stepped outside once more. The night was cool, the sky heavy with stars. The lavender swayed in the breeze, drops of rain still glistening on the petals. I knelt and touched one bloom lightly. "We made it," I whispered. "Justice didn't ruin us, it rebuilt us." Inside, I turned off the lamp and sat in the new rocking chair, a cup of tea in my hands. The clock ticked softly on the wall. My reflection in the window looked calm, lines of age softened by the low light. For a moment, I imagined my husband sitting across from me, smiling, nodding as if to say, "You did it right, Evelyn." I took a slow sip of tea. "It's over," I said aloud, though the words sounded less like an ending and more like a blessing. Then I turned toward the quiet house and spoke to the space that had carried every echo of my life. To anyone still listening, I hope my story reminds you, silence can protect peace, but it should never protect injustice. If you've ever been hurt by family and told to forgive too soon, know this: forgiveness means nothing without respect. The house creaked gently, as if in agreement. I smiled, leaning back. "If you're watching from somewhere out there," I said, softly, "tell me where you're from. Tell me what made you stand up for yourself." Every voice, every story helps another woman remember she's not alone. Outside, the rain eased and the moonlight broke through the clouds, falling across the lavender bed. The petals shimmered faintly pale violet in the silver glow. I watched them sway until my eyelids grew heavy. As I stood to go inside, I whispered one last line to the night air. "Justice isn't revenge, it's peace you earn after surviving the storm." When I closed the door, the rocking chair creaked, once the clock ticked steady, and the scent of lavender followed me down the hallway. For the first time in years, I turned off every light without fear, and as I slipped into bed, I smiled into the darkness, certain that no one and nothing would ever take my peace again.